Chapter 19, Part 2, Cardiac Physiology, Screencast 4. The topic of this screencast will center around the cardiac cycle. Now, keep in mind, up till now, we have primarily focused on the electrical events associated with cardiac physiology. But also remember what I've said. Electrical first, mechanical second. So none of the things that we're going to talk about now could have happened without the electrical events we have talked about previously. When talking about the cardiac cycle, it really is all of the events that take place in the heart from the start of one beat to the start of the next. The cardiac cycle is split down in two separate phases. One is systole, and that means contraction, and diastole, which is relaxation. Keep in mind, I tend to use or reserve these terms to ventricular action. So ventricular contraction would be systole, and ventricular diastole would be relaxation. Now, another thing to keep in mind that we'll come back to in the next chapter is at rest, the heart spends more time in diastole than systole. That will be important and have an impact on what we'll refer to as mean arterial pressure. Now, as indicated previously when we were introducing valves, we basically talked that the heart is nothing more than two pumps, and as a pump, it generates pressure. These pressure changes will open or close valves based on pressure differences on either side of the valve, and blood will move from high pressure to low pressure through those valves that are actually open. And once again, closed valves are actually preventing the backflow of blood. Now, when we look at ventricular activity, that really is the most prominent event happening during the cardiac cycle. When we talk about ventricular contraction, it directly results in an increase in ventricular pressure. The pressure we are talking about here is the pressure created by the contraction of the ventricles, not due to the blood in the ventricles. It's strictly the pressure from the contracting chamber. As the ventricles contract, the AV valves are pushed closed, and the semilunar valves will be pushed open, and blood will be ejected to the aorta. I'm focusing primarily on the left ventricle, unless I say otherwise, so the exit vessel will be the aorta. During ventricular relaxation, this results in a lowering of ventricular pressure. As a result, the semilunar valves will close. There's no pressure from below that's going to be keeping them open. The AV valves will be open because there's no pressure pushing them closed. Now, we are going to start when all chambers are in a state of relaxation. We'll go over some terminology a little bit later that's specific to some diagrams that we'll be looking at, and there may be some differences from the terminology that's used in the textbook, but it really is the same thing. Now, one thing to keep in mind about a cycle is a cycle has no beginning and no end. We will choose basically as the beginning, all chambers are at rest. So the chambers are at rest. Blood is returning to both atria. This phase of ventricular filling is passive. The AV valves are open because atrial pressure is greater than ventricular pressure, but the semilunar valves are closed as the pressure within the ventricles is still lower than the pressure within the aorta. So here we're looking at atrial contraction and ventricular filling. I prefer to call this mid to late diastole, and that is just personal preference and how I was introduced to the cardiac cycle. Now, keep in mind, it's important that we start in some type of ventricular relaxation or diastole. That's why I use mid to late, and keep in mind that the atria will contract during ventricular relaxation or diastole. So hence mid to late diastole. So we will start to get excitation from the SA node, and this is going to be responsible for contraction of the atria. The atria will contract, pushing any remaining blood into the ventricles. Now, please keep in mind that this is not a large amount, and atrial contribution to ventricular filling is really not a big deal, and where it probably plays the greatest role is during exercise. Now, we want to introduce a new term here. We need something to describe how much blood is in the ventricle at the end of ventricular diastole. We're going to call this end diastolic volume, or EDV. From this point forward, the atria will be relaxed for the remainder of this turn of the cardiac cycle. The next phase is isovolumetric. Our text is using a different term, isovolumic. I prefer isovolumetric, so that's what I will be using. Think about the language, isovolumetric. So this indicates probably no change in volume. So now, the Purkinje fibers will be responsible for initiating excitation of the ventricles. This will cause them to contract. We'll actually see an increase in pressure, causing the AV valves to be pushed closed. At this time, the ventricular pressure is still less than the pressure in the aorta, so the semilunar valve is still closed. Now, keep in mind here, we are looking at an isovolumetric phase. All of the valves are closed, so we could expect a very large increase in pressure, but it will not last very long. When you increase pressure in a situation that is a closed environment, pressure will go up very quickly because there's nowhere for it to dissipate. As the ventricles are continuing to contract, we get to the point where ventricular pressure is greater than the pressure within the aorta. Now comes the ejection phase. Pressure in the ventricles is now high enough to force open the semilunar valves, and it will continue to contract, and blood will be forced from the ventricles into the aorta. Now, two new terms here. Stroke volume is how much blood is ejected by the ventricles as they contract. Now, this is important, so please keep this in mind. This is something that you will have to calculate on the second unit exam. There's two things that we need so that we can calculate stroke volume. We've already addressed one of them. The other parameter that we have to talk about is end systolic volume. End systolic volume is how much blood is left in the ventricle once contraction is complete. So stroke volume is actually the difference between end diastolic volume, what you started with, and end systolic volume, what's left after contraction. I've given you an example calculation here. For example, a stroke volume of 70 mils is equal or calculated from an end diastolic volume of 130 mils and an end systolic volume of 60 mils, hence giving us that value of 70 mils for stroke volume. So once again, stroke volume is the difference between end diastolic volume, EDV, and end systolic volume, ESV. Next, we'll be coming that isovolumetric relaxation. The ventricles are done contracting. They will begin to relax and expand, resulting in a significant lowering in pressure. Arterial pressure at this point is greater than ventricular pressure. This will result in the closure of the semilunar valves. The AV valves are still closed. Once again, this is another one of those phases when all valves are closed. Blood cannot enter or leave. And this is going to be called an isovolumetric phase or isovolumetric relaxation, which is the terminology I prefer to use. Then we're at this point where all the chambers are relaxed. We have atrial relaxation and the ventricles are filling. Remember, the majority of ventricular filling is going to be passive. Atrial blood pressure forces the AV valves to open and blood passively flows into the ventricles. The semilunar valves are still closed since arterial pressure is greater than ventricular pressure. So let's kind of walk through what we just kind of described using this diagram. Now here, they're starting with what they refer to as atrial contraction and ventricular filling. I prefer to call this mid to late diastole. Remember, diastole is ventricular relaxation. We're close to the end and the ventricles are getting ready to contract. So the atria will be contracting during this phase. So if we look at the chambers, the atria will begin to contract. The ventricles are in a state of relaxation. Ventricular pressure is less than atrial pressure, and it's also less than arterial pressure. So the AV valves are open, and we'll also be looking at the semilunar valves are closed. Now is the isovolumetric contraction. The atria are relaxed, but the ventricles are now contracting. Ventricular pressure is greater than atrial pressure, causing the valves, AV valves to close, but it's also less than aortic pressure, so the semilunar valve is still closed. Remember, during the isovolumetric contraction phase, the ventricles continue to contract until ventricular pressure is greater than aortic pressure, and we now enter the ejection phase. The atria are still relaxed. The ventricles, remember, are still contracting. Ventricular pressure is greater than atrial pressure, and also it's greater than aortic pressure. So now the AV valves are closed, but the semilunar valves are open, and blood will be leaving the ventricles during this phase. Once the ventricles are done contracting, they will begin to relax. This is going to be the isovolumetric relaxation. So the chambers, both the atria and the ventricles, are in a state of relaxation. Ventricular pressure is greater than atrial pressure, so the AV valve is closed. Ventricular pressure is also less than aortic pressure, so the semilunar valves are closed also. Hence isovolumetric, no way in, no way out, constant volume. Then we get to the end, and this is early diastole or atrial relaxation and ventricular filling. This is where the majority of ventricular filling takes place, and remember, is passive in nature. Both chambers are relaxed, so atria and ventricles in that state of relaxation. Ventricular pressure is less than atrial pressure, so the AV valves are open, so blood can passively move into the ventricles, and ventricular pressure is less than aortic pressure, so the semilunar valves are closed, and the cycle continues to mid to late diastole and on and on and on. Now, something that I've talked about previously is really important, and we refer to that as ventricular balance. What this means that even though there are significant differences in the thickness of the walls of the right and left ventricles, with the left ventricles being significantly greater, there is no difference in the amount of blood when those ventricles contract. So kind of think about this. There's no gauge, there's no chip, there's nothing to monitor and maintain this difference. This is just how the heart works. Now, it is important that we have this balance. Otherwise, if they were not the same, eventually we would get to some type of edema and swelling would take place. Now, this is the version of the cardiac cycle diagram that I prefer. The next slide shows the version of this diagram that the textbook has, and I'm just not a big fan of it. I'll not really talk about it, I'll introduce it, but I'm going to use this particular diagram here to really address what's happening during the cardiac cycle. And what I like about this diagram, you can actually see the interaction of all of the cardiac parameters during each phase of the cardiac cycle. So keep in mind a couple of things. Each column here is a phase of the cardiac cycle. That's important. And what we're actually doing is looking at the state of the valves. We're also looking at pressure changes, and those will be referenced to aortic pressure, atrial pressure, and ventricular pressure. And we're also looking at volume throughout the cardiac cycle or each phase. That is what I'm going to put the emphasis on. So let's start with mid to late diastole. This is where we still have ventricular filling. And if we look at the volume curve, we can see we're basically close to hitting our plateau and being full. Atrial pressure is greater than ventricular pressure, so the AV valve is open. Ventricular pressure is less than aortic pressure, so the semilunar valve is closed. Now, one thing I want to point out, it is okay for ventricular pressure to approach zero as the ventricles relax. That's not the case when we talk about aortic pressure. So So the other thing that we can see here that's actually taking place during mid to late diastole is atrial contraction. And we can see basically a little bit of extra blood that's being added that's attributable to the contraction of the atria. We now enter systole, and the first phase of systole is going to be isovolumetric contraction. So we can now see that ventricular pressure is greater than atrial pressure, but less than semilunar pressure. So now all the valves are closed based on that relationship, but look at the volume. We have a plateau. That makes sense. This is an isovolumetric phase. There is no way in, no way out, so we'll have a plateau. And remember, this is going to be what we refer to as end diastolic volume. Now notice, the isovolumetric contraction phase is not very long. There is nowhere for the pressure to dissipate as the ventricles are contracting, so it goes up very, very quickly. So as the ventricles continue to contract, we're now going to enter the ejection phase. The AV valves are still closed, but now the force generated by the contracting ventricles is greater than aortic pressure, so the semilunar valves are open. And now look at the dramatic impact that we see here. So due to that increase in ventricular pressure continuing to increase, forcing open the semilunar valves and continuing to contract and ejecting blood out of the aorta, we can actually see the big decrease in ventricular volume. As the ventricles begin to relax, we hit the isovolumetric relaxation. Ventricular pressure drops dramatically. We're at a point where all the valves are closed, but also notice we have that plateau indicating that there is no way in, no way out. So another isovolumetric phase, and this also is a very short phase. Then we move into early diastole. We now notice that atrial pressure is greater than ventricular pressure, resulting in the open AV valves. Ventricular pressure is still much less than ventricular pressure, so the semilunar valves are closed. This is where we actually see the majority of filling within the ventricles, and as noted, this is passive in nature. Now, this is the diagram that we talked about that is in the textbook, and I just don't like this. It covers the same information. I just don't like how it's organized. Things do not really line up as nicely as they do in the previous diagram. Please feel free to use this diagram, but it is not something that I'm going to put an emphasis on. The previous diagram will be provided on the second unit exam, and there will be some questions related to the cardiac cycle that are based on that particular exam.